In this first couple of classes, or this class here today, we are going to be really having to do a little background to the New Testament because where we left off with the Old Testament, Malachi, there's about 400 years that transpires between Malachi and John the Baptist, and so Malachi prophesied about John the Baptist. But so we have a little making up to do in terms of our thinking relative to the way it is in the world. I've given you, I think, the outline for the class, so you kind of know at the very beginning what our goal is. We have 24 sessions, and today we will be doing lesson 1 and 2, Introduction to the New Testament and why 4 Gospels, and then we'll try to go through and stay pretty much on track to what we have there each Saturday, of course, doing 2 lessons, lesson 3, lesson 4, the next Saturday that we meet. Today, in some ways, I'm going to apologize for this first session because there's a lot of background, a lot of history, a lot of detail that we have to kind of lay out there to help you. There'll be a little bit more reading than normal in the class, but there's a lot of 400 years of history to kind of capsulize in just a short period of time so that we can understand a little bit better about what is happening in the New Testament. Sometimes we hear names, we hear names of groups or parties of people. We hear things like Sadducees, Pharisees, scribes. We hear Herodians, Galileans. What are these concepts? What are they going to do for us? Also, in relationship to certain world powers and people, there are rulers that are mentioned, like Herod and different ones, Agrippa, and different people. And by giving kind of a one-time introduction to all of this, it will save us a lot of time in the future, as you can see how kind of the world developed a little bit, and some of the powers under which Palestine, the Holy Land, came under during that 400-year period. I like to look at this 400-year period from Malachi to the coming of John the Baptist as really a preparation for the gospel. God preparing the world for the coming of the gospel, for the coming of Jesus Christ, for the coming of the New Testament church and the church planting that would take place under the ministry of Paul. Actually, as we said before, history is really his story. It is a story about Jesus. It's a story about the gospel of Jesus Christ. And whether Old or New Testament, it all has to do with God's plan of redemption. From Genesis chapter 1 and 2 all the way to Revelation chapter 21 and 22, we have this story of redemption, God bringing man back to Him, but also going on to fulfill God's original intention when He created man in the first place. And so history is important in that sense, but it shows us again that God kind of controls the affairs of nations. His hand is upon them. And there are quite a number of things that happened, even though we're dealing with various empires and dynasties and this group and that group. Some very important things happened to prepare the world for the coming of Jesus. Prepare the world for the gospel. Jesus told His disciples in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, I want you to go in all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He said, I want you to start in Jerusalem, go to Samaria, Judea, and the uttermost parts of the earth. The only way that they could fulfill that was for some of these preparations to actually take place. And so that's the only thing that's probably going to make some of this history exciting, is for us to see that what God was doing and how He was preparing the setting for what was going to come. And so we're going to look at this, and like I say, it might be a little bit more detailed than you'd like to have it for today, and I might do more reading than we'd normally like to do in our classes, but just for the sake of accuracy and to help us to move through it more quickly, we will do that. When we left off in the Old Testament, especially with Ezra and Nehemiah and the rebuilding of the temple and the return of Jerusalem, the Persians, the Medo-Persian Empire, was really in power at that time. And what we're looking at in this section, number 1, it says, what world powers controlled Palestine during the intertestamental period? We're not talking about dynasties or empires controlling the world. We're only thinking in terms of Palestine itself. Because even though the Persian Empire may have controlled the world for different dates, or Rome or whatever, Palestine is what we're talking about. That's the area where Jesus functioned. That's where most of the New Testament has relevance. And we're talking about who controlled Palestine during that period of time. And so these dates reflect more a relationship to Palestine than it does anything else. And so we're going to look at the various ones and the dates that are given here for that. And again, the dates that are given are not relative. If you've learned in secular history some other dates for Persia or Greek or Greece or whatever, it only relates to their actual control over the area of Palestine. So let's just make sure we have that clear. All right, under the Persian period, 536 to 333, the united Medo-Persian Empire conquered the fierce Assyrians. The Assyrians were the ones who took the Israelites into captivity. They conquered, the Medo-Persian Empire conquered them. They became a primary world power, even over Babylon and so forth. And under Cyrus, if you remember, the king of Persia, we looked at him a little bit when we were looking through the Old Testament. Many of the Israelites were encouraged to go back to Palestine and rebuild their temple. That's your blank there. They were given the privilege of rebuilding their temple. One of the philosophies that Cyrus had as a world leader was different than many. But his idea was, okay, come in, you conquer a people. Now, Babylon had been the one that had destroyed the temple. And now the Medo-Persian Empire has come in. And Cyrus's philosophy was, if you're going to try to dominate a conquered people, you're going to try, if you take everything away from them, they're not going to be very good subjects and very loyal to you. They'll have every reason in the world to despise you. And so what he would do, as he was leading the world, so to speak, when he conquered a people, he would give them back some of their religious expression so that they would be favorable to him. And, you take people's religion away, they'll hate you forever. This is what the Romans tried to do, And so Cyrus, what he did with them was very favorable to them. Hey, you go back to your city, Jerusalem, has been destroyed by the Babylonians. You go back there, you rebuild your temple. Here, we'll give you some money to do so, give you some help to get it done. And in so doing, he was hoping that they would have a favorable relationship to him, which in a sense they did. Going back to the notes there, a significant thing happened in this period is that the synagogue system was established under Ezra to promote the reading and study of the Old Testament among both the Jews and the Palestinians, both in Palestine and in exile. The synagogue system is going to be very important as we go through here because it was built, the synagogue was laid out very much like a local church. They had their eldership. It was a place where people would gather for the teaching and preaching of the Word. For Israelites particularly that were in captivity, this was important because they didn't have any other place to worship. The temple would always be in place, but the synagogue would be where people on a local level would gather together. It would have eldership covering, and on a local level. And this is going to be important later on when Paul starts churches. His main method of starting churches was in these cities where synagogues had been established. He would go first to the synagogue, preach the gospel to those who supposedly were waiting for their Messiah. And oftentimes that would be his core for starting a church. In some cases, most of the synagogue was converted. In other cases, just a few people. But nonetheless, it was kind of a ready system that was set up throughout. And so again, all of this was good preparation for what would come later. Final paragraph there, another significant thing that happened in this period was that had a huge bearing on the understanding of the New Testament was a serious antagonism and rivalry developed between the Jews and the Samaritans. I know when we come into Jesus' day, we see this seem like intense hatred between the Jews and the Samaritans. And even Jesus picks up on it. He tells a story that we commonly refer to as the Good Samaritan. Jesus was really playing on this whole rivalry because to the Jews it would be like he would be the most unlikely person in all the world who would ever stoop down and help anybody, especially a Jew who was hurt. He'd probably just kick him again. So Jesus was sort of playing on that when he even told that story about who is my neighbor. But nonetheless, how did that develop? Well, it really started back even in the days of the rebuilding of the temple in Ezra and Nehemiah. The Samaritans were some of the most antagonistic people toward them, and the ones that mocked them and tried to hinder their process of rebuilding more than anybody else. And that national hatred that started there kind of just accelerated during the ages, so that it's like a lot of these family feuds you hear about sometimes. In America, they joke about these people up in the hills who have these family feuds, And the feud started over some small matter, who knows, 200 years ago, and they all hate each other. They just don't know why, And they carry that hatred from generation to generation. Ask somebody in modern times, well, why is it that we hate them? I don't know. We just do, Just don't like them. Why? I don't know. We just don't. So it's kind of the way it was in Jesus' day. The Samaritans were, as I said, some of the main opposition that they had in the days of Nehemiah, and that just continued kind of like a national grudge. And we see that today. We see sometimes nations have grudges against nations. And you mentioned, certain nationalities. I'm going to be careful here because if I say it, I'll get messed up. But in Europe, there's certain, if you mention, like if you're in Greece and you mention a certain other name of another people group, they'll just get infuriated, And, it's like everybody's placed in the same. Well, that's kind of the way it was here. So that's the Persian period. And again, the thing we're highlighting here are the things that really make a difference. The rebuilding of the temple. That's the same temple, ultimately, that Jesus would be involved with. It's the same temple that existed in Jesus' day. It was never as great as Solomon's temple, as you all know. But it took quite a period of time to build. And things don't last 500 years in our building of things, but in those days they lasted a little longer. They used some stone and different things, and of course they kept it up. The next period is the Greek period from 333 to 323. Under the leadership of Alexander the Great, perhaps the greatest military leader of all time, the world was brought under the control of the Greek Empire in just a few short years. Alexander subjected most of the world from Greece to India. And there's a legend that he actually went to Palestine, and at that time he was shown the predictions of Daniel about the kingdoms of the world, and he was so impressed that he became very benevolent to the Jewish people, and so he was very gracious to them. Perhaps the most significant thing that happened under the Greek period is that of the unification of the world under the Greek language, and in a lesser extent, Greek culture. This would eventually prove extremely beneficial to the spread of the gospel. And in the last statement there, most of the New Testament will be written in the Greek language, which was the universal language of the time. Again, we're talking about the preparation of the world for the coming of the gospel. And by the fact that the Greeks, whose focus was on education and other things and culture, dominated the world, one of the ways they realized that they would have to unite the world is to unite the world under a language. And so they promoted the Greek language throughout the world so that while everybody still had their native language or their customary language, whether it be Hebrew or whatever, they also kind of learned to speak Greek because it was the language of commerce. It was the language that you could get around on. It was like the universal language. It's sort of like, and I hate to, I don't want to offend anybody, but it's sort of like English today. It's kind of the language of business. If in Japan, everybody wants to learn English. Why? Well, because they can converse with different people in different countries of the world. If you have a little bit of English, you can get by in just about every culture. And that's kind of the way it was with Greek back then. And when you think in terms of preaching the gospel or going from nation to nation and all the nations, it's kind of one of the biggest barriers to preaching the gospel is language. And so right here again we see God's not foolish here. I mean, He controls the affairs of these nations, and the Greeks are going to come in and they're going to give a language that eventually the New Testament will be written in. And most of what Paul was going to preach, he was going to preach in Greek, and he was going to go to all these different places, and they were going to understand him because Greek was somewhat of a universal language in that regard. Even though everybody had their own language, they also kind of had another language. You know what they call somebody who speaks 3 languages, don't you? It's a trilingualist. Somebody who speaks 2 languages is a bilingualist. Somebody who speaks 1 language, you know what they call them? American. Yep. Americans have trouble learning other languages because they never really seem to have a need to. Like most countries are surrounded by people that don't speak all kinds. Like here in South Africa, there are 11 official languages, and you're just surrounded with it all the time. And so in America, you're rarely. People are starting to learn Spanish now because there's quite an influx of people from the south of the border, but normally speaking, we don't interface in commerce all the time with other languages. And so, where in other countries it can be more of a natural thing, in ours we're all monolingualists. All right. So we have the Greek period. That gives way to the Egyptian period. Now, the Egyptians weren't the world power at this time, but they did come to power in the area of Palestine under the leadership of Ptolemaeus. Egypt took control of Palestine. They would remain in control for well over 100 years. They were very kind to the Jews, and it was not uncommon for a steady stream of Jews to move freely from Palestine to Egypt. You know, when we think about Joseph trying to escape Herod's death sentence on children, where did he go? He went to Egypt. Well, you know, in the Old Testament, you wouldn't do that. You know, but in the New Testament, because of this relationship that was developed during this period, people went freely to back and forth here without any problem. A lot of Jews actually moved and relocated to Egypt for one reason or another. And so it was a safe place. He could go there because the Jews were welcomed there. And it goes back to this particular period of time. But more significantly, the second paragraph there was under the leadership of Ptolemaeus' leadership, that Alexandria, which was like the Egyptian capital at that time, became a major learning center and the location of the greatest library of the world. Anybody that knows much about education history knows that Alexandria was like the number one education center of the world. They were known for their largest library. They had every book that they could ever get their hands on known to man. And one of their objectives was to be the greatest resource, the greatest library resource on the planet. And as a result, they had this love for books, love for reading, and a desire to make sure that books could be read. And so one of the things that they did during this period of time, Ptolemaeus promoted this, was he took initiatives that the Hebrew Old Testament, which very small numbers of people read Hebrew, the Hebrew Old Testament would actually be translated into Greek. And so Ptolemaeus was not a Christian, and had this vision for a library, vision that it could be the learning center for the world, was interested in the various religions, not just the Hebrew religion, but make sure to get this stuff so that people can actually read it and know about it. And so he decides he's going to fund and promote the idea of translating the Old Testament into Greek, which is called the Septuagint, which you have here. And it's called a Septuagint because 70 scholars were tasked. Septuagint comes from the word 70, 7. And so 70 scholars were going to work on this task to translate the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. And this is significant because now this Hebrew Bible, which was only be able to be read by a few, suddenly can be read by almost everybody in the world, because you got a world religion that came to us from the Greeks, and now you've got the Bible being translated into Greek, and also the ability to distribute it, which again had never really taken place before. This is going to be the Bible that Jesus is going to use most of the time and quote from most of the time. This is going to be the Bible that Paul was going to quote from when he went around and preached. It's going to be their King James Version of the Bible, so to speak. It was the one that Paul used. For those that think King James Version of the Bible Paul used, no, he used the Septuagint. Some people, when they criticize modern versions, he says, hey, I don't need anything but the authorized King James Version. If it was good enough for Paul, it's good enough for me. No. Paul read the Septuagint. If you want Paul's Bible, that's the one you're going to have to read. So this is significant, again, as we said, because it was written in the common language of the world. And in a sense, we think Bible versions are kind of a modern phenomenon, but in actuality, putting the language in the common language of the people started right back here. Then we move from that Egyptian period to the Syrian period. The Egyptians' hold on things grew weaker and weaker, and other powers grew stronger, including the Romans. The Seleucids, or Syrians, were seeking to exercise their own freedom from dominance and desired control of Palestine to serve as a buffer zone to the rest of the world. If you look at that, where Palestine is placed in relationship to Syria, if Syria is going to be opposed to the Egyptians or to the Greeks or to the Romans or any of those other groups, Palestine is like a buffer zone to them. And so they felt like it was valuable to get that piece of real estate. It's amazing how many people over the years have fought over that piece of real estate, and they're still fighting over it today. And but they felt like if they could have Palestine and control it, then at least if opposing armies came, they'd have to go through Palestine to get to them, and that could be tore up instead of their own areas. And so, but the Syrians, as it goes back into history, had a tremendous hatred for the Jewish people. You know, Assyria, Syrians, all those, their past history and so forth. And so they were very brutal and very cruel people. And this next paragraph, the Syrians had a tremendous hatred for the Jewish people, and under the leadership of Antiochus Epiphanes, killed many of the priests, most of the priests, changed the name of Jerusalem to Antioch to reflect the name of this leader. That's where the word Antioch comes from. There's two other Antiochs in the New Testament. For a while, Jerusalem was called Antioch as well. They changed the name to Antioch, and the name of this ruler, dedicated the temple to Jupiter, and outlawed Jewish observances, including the Passover, a rough time for the Jews. When Antiochus declared himself to be a god and set up an altar to Jupiter in the temple, offering pig's blood upon it, the Jews saw this as the abomination of desolations to which Daniel had referred in Daniel chapter 12, verse 11. Unfortunately, he went too far, antagonizing the Jewish people. He aroused the wrath of a man by the name of I always struggle on his first name, Mattathias Maccabeus, and his four sons ended up becoming freedom fighters for the Jews, and they met with some success, as we'll see here by the next period, named after them, the Maccabean period. Under the Maccabean period, 165 to 63 BC, Mattathias Maccabeus began his quest for freedom by killing the priests of Jupiter who had been functioning in the temple, and then he fled to the hills and organized a volunteer army of about 10,000, more farmers than soldiers, but because of their kind of guerrilla warfare tactics, even though they were outnumbered 5-1 by the Syrians, they ended up conquering or driving out the Assyrians with many heroic acts of bravery. Judas Maccabeus, who was the son, went to Jerusalem, cleansed the temple and the city, and brought a restoration of worship. It took several years before the complete control of the land was accomplished under the leadership of the Maccabean family. Unfortunately, after their death, their nephews, grandsons began to rule, and they were politically corrupt, and the nation went into a time, again, of spiritual decline. But you can read about that. The book of Maccabees are part of the Old Testament Apocrypha. That is, they're not books that are contained in our Bible, but they are books that were written to record some of the historical feats that took place during that time. That leads us into the Roman period. Of course, Rome was rising throughout this whole time in strength, and eventually grew to the point where they were able to more and more accomplish their vision for world domination. One of the needs that the empire had as they were trying to dominate the world was a better way to transport goods, not just for trade purposes, but also for the purposes of keeping their soldiers' supply lines open and so forth. And he hired a guy by the name of Pompey. You ever hear of him? To clear the Mediterranean of pirates. Because what they would do, they'd send out goods, and the ships were always being commandeered and taken over by pirates. And so he was doing this, and in the course of his efforts, he landed in Palestine. And he saw how the Maccabees at that time were warring against each other, their corruption that was taking place, and he seized it as an opportunity to take Palestine, and he took the Maccabean leadership into captivity and brought them to Rome. From that point, Rome began their domination of Palestine, and this is kind of where we find the situation when Jesus was born. Rome is really in control of Palestine. The Jews hated the Romans. For one thing, they lived an awful long way away. But the Romans had little respect for the Jews. And one of the big problems that the Jews faced in interacting with the Romans is that the Romans believed in many gods. They didn't care about, you could have as many gods as you wanted to. That was not a big deal. As long as you acknowledge Caesar as God, no problem. You can have all the gods you want to, as long as Caesar's one of them. Well, for the Jews who were monotheistic, and they only believed in one God, and they had plenty of scripture to back that up, they could not accept Caesar as their God. And even though the Romans would allow them to practice their own religion, they always struggled with this thing of making Caesar God and giving the proper homage to Caesar. And so even in Jesus' day, when they talk a lot about Caesar and is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar and all this kind of stuff, all of that comes out of this kind of despising of the whole idea of Caesar. Because in the Roman thinking, much like the Japanese thinking before World War II, the emperor was a god and to be acknowledged and worshipped as a god. In fact, later on in Christianity, one of the problems that they would have under people like Justin Martyr is that one of the ways Rome wanted to prove the loyalty of Christians to the Roman Empire was asking them to offer incense on an altar acknowledging Caesar as God. And many Christians lost their life because they refused to do so. And one of the most famous examples of that is a man by the name of Justin, who's referred to now as Justin Martyr, for obvious reasons. But the whole trial that he went through is actually recorded for us in history, which is very interesting because he refused to offer the incense to Caesar during that time. But nonetheless, there was great antagonism between them. The Romans always saw the Jews and the Israelites as being a difficult people to cooperate. And they tried to give them as much rope, enough slack as they could by allowing them to keep their Sanhedrin, which would be their local council, but yet they would rule behind the scenes through that council, and so that the people would not see the Romans in direct rulership to them, but they would see the Sanhedrin kind of between them, and the people would respond better to the leadership that was there. Last paragraph under the Roman period, the greatest things that the Romans did for the gospel was to create a universal society of laws, to establish a kingdom of peace, sometimes referred to as the Pax Romana, and to establish a system of roads that made worldwide travel much easier and safer than it had ever been before. Rome was noted for their system of laws. In fact, many of our legal systems today are actually based on what Rome did. And a lot of the modern law that we have comes out of a lot of the things that they did. And they established a kingdom of peace for a lot of years, which created, and in order to maintain, of course, this whole rule over these areas, they needed to develop roads. And the roads that they do, they put a lot of money into roads. A lot more than they do in Johannesburg. How many know that? No, they put a lot of money into roads. And in many of those roads that they built, because they built them a lot of stone and so forth, are still being used today. There's one road called the Appian Way, which is very famous, and the roads are still being used today. Now, you know, we got potholes after a week. They got roads that last for 2,000 years. But nonetheless, this was, again, preparation for the gospel. You think about it. You know, that now, because of the Roman Empire, there was a universal system of law. There was Roman citizen could go anywhere and be thoroughly protected. The roads were able to be traveled. They weren't as dangerous as they could have been. And you could go anywhere. And that was totally unusual until the Romans did what they did. Now you think about that in terms of spreading the gospel. It was they paved the way, literally. They paved the way for the gospel to be preached into all the world. Roman numeral 2 here, what was the political setting of the time of Jesus' birth? The political setting, the time of Jesus' birth, as it stated above, the world was under the dominance of the Roman Empire. Palestine was under Roman rule with Roman appointed leaders. And what Rome did is they placed kings, they called them kings, or tetrarchs, over the Jews. Antipas was given the initial position as tetrarch of Palestine about 47 BC and served in that position for 10 years. Now we're focusing on only the ones that are relevant to our New Testament study, because these are the ones that are referred to at times, or the context is referred to at times throughout the New Testament. It helps us a little bit as we understand what's going on. Herod the Great was the follower of Antipas, and he starts the line of Herod. It's going to be a dynasty. There's going to be several Herods. So sometimes you'll hear Herod Agrippa or Herod this, Herod that. They're related to each other through lineage. And this is the Herod that was in charge. You see 37 to 4 BC. Now, you see 4 BC, how could Jesus be born there? Well, technically, as they search back, Jesus was probably not born in 0, because when they first dated things, they realized now they were probably a few years off. He probably was born in 4 BC or somewhere around there instead of actually 0, even though we're dated from before Christ and after Christ. So from a historical point of view, they've come up with this. But he was the Herod who was in charge, and he was a very paranoid leader. He always thought everybody was out to get him. I've always told Trey, you're not paranoid. Everybody is out to get you. No, but he thought everybody was out to get him, and he was very suspicious of anybody as a threat to his own leadership and his own kingdom. In fact, one of the things he did is he married one of the women of the Maccabean family to kind of ensure a safe relationship with them. Of course, that was one of the things that kings and rulers did, is they would marry into lines of people, whether they'd trade, intermarry, so that they could keep peace among family members. But he didn't trust her anyway. She thought she was going to sell him out and plot his death, and so there were some trumped up charges that were brought against her, and he allowed her to be killed. And he had this method of killing off any potential rivals, and it continued all the way through his reign until he had this unusual visit from 3 Persian kings that we call wise men, who told of another king who was going to be born. And what was his reaction? We're going to kill off any possible rival that might be out there. Now, when we understand that that wasn't the first time he ever did something like that, we understand it a little bit better, that he was just a terribly paranoid leader, and he was always plotting the death of anybody that he thought might be against him. Now, he died early on in this whole process, and when he died, there was a lot of contesting about who should succeed him. He had 3 different sons, and so what ended up happening is that the kingdom was sort of divided into 3, and they had some rivalry between them. The first person we have here is Archelaus, and he obviously didn't rule very long. He was most despised by his other 2 brothers, but he was given rule over the southern areas of Judea, and this included the city of Bethlehem. Now, it's interesting because he was really the worst of these 3, of the 3. He was a short-lived leader who was known for his brutality toward the Jews and the Samaritans, and it was because he was ruler over the region which included Bethlehem that when Joseph came back out of Egypt with Jesus, instead of going to Bethlehem, where they had come from, he went to Nazareth instead. In fact, in Matthew 2:22 and 23, you can read about that. And so he didn't want to go to that region because of the cruel leadership that was there. He ended up going to Nazareth, which really was all fulfillment of prophecy. That Jesus would be a Nazarene. And yet, he's born in Bethlehem, out of Egypt, went to Egypt. Out of Egypt I have called my son. And then he goes to Nazareth. He shall be called a Nazarene. And so this complex thing all has to do with political issues. And Joseph was making a kind of a rational decision here. He didn't have an angel tell him to go to Nazareth. He didn't need an angel to tell him not to go to Bethlehem. And so he was looking for alternatives, obviously. And they had lived in Nazareth before, so that's not a problem. The other son here was Philip, and he ruled from 4 to 34 A.D. And Philip was given rule over the northern areas. He was a relatively peaceful leader, well-liked by his subject, eventually married Salome, the daughter of Herodias, who was responsible for the death of John the Baptist. She was the one who asked for John's head. And so he married her. He must have seen something in her that John the Baptist certainly didn't see. But nonetheless, he married her. And then we have the third one, and he's an important one, is Antipas, who is called Herod. Oftentimes in the Scripture, again, that's why we sometimes get confused. He's called Herod Antipas, and or just plain Herod. Of all the sons, he played the most prominent role in biblical history because his region, including Galilee and Perea, is the area where both John the Baptist and Jesus did most of their ministry. He's the one who was most responsible for the death of John the Baptist. When the people reported of Jesus' ministry to him as possibly John risen from the dead, he was interested in meeting Jesus. He never did until a little later when Jesus was arrested and brought to trial. He was reported to be later interested in killing Jesus in Luke 13. And when he was the Herod who tried Jesus, and he wanted to see a miracle from Jesus. And when Jesus did not perform for him, he abused him and sent him back to Pilate for sentencing. So he was the one who did all of that. Following him then was Agrippa the First. Agrippa was the grandson of Herod the Great, going back a few generations. He was a very indulgent and vain man who, in an effort to find favor with the Jews, became a persecutor of Christianity. He came against Christianity. He was the one who was responsible for the death of the first apostle, James, in Acts chapter 12. And shortly after that, we read about his terrible death. Actually, that last verse should be Acts chapter 12, verse 20 to 25, where he had a very violent and very unusual death that's recorded there. Most people believe it was a judgment of God on him for his attitude and reaction to Christianity at that particular time. But it's interesting, whenever you have dynasty-type leadership, you don't always get people that are worthy rulers. That is, they're not elected by the people. They don't necessarily aren't elected because they have qualifications to rule. They just happen to be blood related. And he was one of those guys that probably never should have been in power. And because he was trying to keep a favorability factor going for him, he ended up being a persecutor of Christianity and personally received judgment from the Lord. Agrippa II was his son and eventually came to power. He was only 17 when his father died, so he didn't come to power immediately. At least he had regents that worked with him for a season, and then finally in 48 he kind of took the reins. He was known to have lived in an incestuous relationship with his sister Bernice. All of these will be characters in the book of Acts, chapter 25, when we see them. Seems to have had a good understanding of Jewish affairs. He was consulted by Rome on religious matters, and he was one of the ones who heard Paul's case after he was arrested by the Jews. And if Paul hadn't already appealed to Caesar before that, he probably would have let him go. Roman numeral 3, what are the other political leaders that are relevant to the New Testament study? In addition to kings or tetrarchs being placed over Palestine, there were governors, procurators who served regionally. So you have a broader group, and then right here regionally, maybe in Jerusalem itself, you have governors. One such governor in 26 to 36 was Pontius Pilate. He was not an airline employee, as some think, but he was an important figure in the New Testament. He was the procurator during the most significant time of Bible history, being the one who tried Jesus and ultimately consented to his crucifixion. One of the things that you see there constantly is this tension between Rome and the Jews. They're trying to keep peace with the Jews. They're trying to keep Palestine in some semblance of order. And so you can see how some of these weak Roman leaders will just conciliate and give way to the pressure that's on them, because the Jews are a very proud people, and they're not going to be ruled easily by anybody, and they have what they want to do. And so Pilate is being pushed around by everybody in this story, as you well know. There was another one in between him, which we aren't going to talk about because he plays no role in biblical history. But then later on we come to a guy by the name of Antonius Felix. Was not a cat. He was a cool cat. Felix was the procurator of Judea when Paul was being persecuted by the Jews. He was a corrupt leader who was more interested in bribes than in justice. He left Paul in prison, even though without any charges brought against him. Left him in prison for 2 years, hoping somebody would bribe him to let him go. And so, again, tells you what kind of a leader he was. And then he was followed by a guy by the name of Porcius Festus. And Festus succeeded Felix and was left with Paul's case hanging in the balance. Festus, again, was more interested in making inroads to the Jews rather than justice in Paul's case. Roman numeral 4, what are some of the religious and cultural background that serve to help us understand the New Testament? What we're going to do here is just look through some concepts, some parties, and so forth that were around during Jesus' day, and just give some insight to them. Because as we go to the Gospels, as we go to the book of Acts and other things, these words and concepts will come up from time to time, and this will just help us save time, and it'll help you understand things better as we go through. We've already talked about the first one there, the synagogue. And under the synagogue, again, it was during this 400 silent year period that really kept Jewish religion alive. Most trace it all the way back to Ezra, but it was very similar to set up, as I said before, to the local church. There's still only one temple, but each city had a synagogue with its elders, and that was very much patterned. Go ahead, David, and finish that section there. These synagogues set a beautiful stage for the later development of the local church. And so Jesus, He inaugurated His ministry by going into a synagogue, a local synagogue where the Scripture was read, and sometimes they would have different people get up and read it. For the rest of the group, Jesus on that particular day got up and read it, and He read out of the Old Testament, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because He hath anointed me to preach the gospel." And then He closed the book and said, "This day this Scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." So that was kind of the inauguration of Jesus' ministry right there in the synagogue. The second organization, really, that's important here is the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin, this was the official Jewish council or board that was established maybe as early as Jehoshaphat. We have some scripture there where the leadership of the nation of Israel would come together to form a council. It was a judicial body for the governing of the nation, in a sense. And this consisted of 70 plus, sometimes plus or minus a couple once in a while, but it consisted generally of the high priest plus 24 chief priests, 24 elders, and 22 scribes or lawyers to try to interpret what everybody was saying, of course, or codify what was going to be talked about. And this group was given plenty of latitude by Rome, and Rome kind of worked through them as much as possible so that it appeared that the laws were coming from the Jews instead of the Romans. And so it's important to know that this group was the one who tried Jesus. They condemned Him to death. They did it all illegally, by the way, and we'll maybe point that out as we go through. They broke their own laws in trying to put Jesus on trial. They had a night meeting, which was unheard of, and they weren't supposed to do, and various other things that they did to convict Jesus. But nonetheless, they did, and some of the apostles stood before this body of people. They tried very much to intimidate the apostles who were now preaching the gospel, were now preaching about this Jesus who they said was risen from the dead. And this group was the one that would threaten the apostles, threaten them with death and so forth. The only thing is, it was to some degree an idle threat, because they could sentence someone to death, but they could not carry out the death penalty without the Romans getting involved. They were not given any privilege by the Romans to put anybody to death. And so that's why this struggle between the Jews and Pilate during this time, because Pilate was the only one who could actually kill or crucify Jesus. It had to be the Romans that did it. And so that was kind of the limitation of their authority. The third group we want to talk about are the priests. The priests at this time were not just like the priests in the Old Testament, because during that 400 silent year period, the Jewish priesthood developed into something a little bit more than that. After the captivity and the return under Ezra and Nehemiah, the priests, in the absence of a king, began to serve not just as religious leaders, but they also served as civil leaders and princes. And so these priests that were represented in the Sanhedrin actually represented sometimes geographical areas. And they were kind of like the civil authority as well as the religious authority. That is, when it came to the actual Jewish people themselves. And so the priests, it's important for us to understand that they were not just religious figures, but now they also, this is why it's so important that when they named the high priest, Annas and Caiaphas and some of these guys that were involved in this thing with Jesus, is that like he was, as far as the Jews were concerned, he was the highest figure, not just when it came to religious matters, but also in relationship to the Jewish people themselves. He was also the equivalent almost of a king, apart from the Romans, that is, in their own sphere. And so very, very important figure in relationship to that. Another important word that you'll hear as we go through are scribes. Scribes in the New Testament. The scribes were the students, the interpreters and teachers of the Scripture or the law. They were held in high esteem by the people. They were to be the experts in the law. Sometimes they were referred to as lawyers. But they were to give themselves to this. And they were the experts in expounding the Scripture. And they were serious opponents of Jesus. Of course, all these guys were. The priests were, the scribes were. Everybody had their own reason why they wanted to be opposed to Jesus. The priests, of course, Jesus is promoting certain ideas. He's preaching certain things, and he's not of the priestly line. The scribes, well, Jesus did not go to the rabbinical schools, and yet he's purporting to preach and teach. one of the things we'll find as we go through that the scribes and some of these, they're always trying to set him up with their questions. I've been in Bible school for over 30 years, and I know how students can do that for you sometimes. You know, they try to get you this question to trick you a little bit. And, of course, Jesus was too sharp for these guys, and he happened to know the Bible better than they did. He also had the Holy Spirit upon him, which helped him a great deal. But here's an example of that in Matthew 22, verse 35. Then one of them, a lawyer, a scribe, asked him a question, testing him, saying, "Teacher, which is the great commandment?" And, of course, Jesus answers him and goes on and so forth. But they're always doing this. In Luke chapter 14, verse 1 to 6, now it happened as he went into the house, one of the rulers of the Pharisees, to eat bread with on the Sabbath, they watched him closely. They watched him closely. And behold, and they wanted to see. And Jesus, answering, spoke to the lawyers and the Pharisees, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" Here's a man that's got dropsy. And Jesus, they're watching him, see what he's going to do. They want to catch him. So Jesus just plays right into their hands. Jesus, answering, spoke to the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" But they kept silent. You're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. He took him, the man with dropsy, and healed him and let him go. Then he answered them, saying, "Which of you, having a donkey or an ox that has fallen into a pit, will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day?" And they could not answer him regarding these things. They just didn't like Jesus. You know, he was too sharp for them. So the scribes were always trying to catch him in his words. Then we have the Pharisees. The Pharisees were another group of people. They were a religious sect that arose during the time of the Maccabees. And they were called separatists by their enemies because they separated themselves from the ambitious political parties of their day. They were the ultra-conservatives of the day. They were sticklers for the letter of the law. I mean, they tried to really do all the commandments, do everything they could do, which is good. But Jesus saw through that because in them it was a matter of work righteousness. And Jesus said, "Except your righteousness exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will no way enter the kingdom of heaven." But they were the ones who were so particular about everything. Jesus was kind of rough on this group of people. John the Baptist was pretty rough on them. In fact, when these guys came to the baptism of John, he told them, "You brood of vipers, who's warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Bring forth fruits meet for repentance." They weren't repentant of anything. They were just going through another external form that they thought might gain them the support of the people. But Jesus called them whitewashed sepulchres. That is, they looked good on the outside. They did all the things on the outside. But on the inside, they were rotten. And that's why Jesus said in Matthew chapter 23, whatever they tell you to do, do. Because they know the law. They know what's right and wrong. Whatever they tell you, but don't do after their works, for they say and they do not. But the Pharisees were, we use the word, he's a real Pharisee. Well, that comes back, obviously, from these days, because it means someone who is pretending on the outside, but on the inside they're really unchanged. Then we have the Sadducees, and these guys were ones that didn't believe in the supernatural, so that's why they were sad, you see. And they were more the aristocratic political party, but they were also the liberals and the modernists of the day. They didn't believe in the supernatural. Acts 23 tells us they didn't believe in angels, they didn't believe in miracles, they didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. Jesus definitely posed a problem to these guys. And it's interesting that the Sadducees and the Pharisees, who normally hated each other, these guys would be at the opposite end of the spectrum. The Pharisees were the legalists, the Sadducees were the grace people, everything was okay, and they were the modernists of the day. But when it came to Jesus, who was their common enemy, when we get through going through all of these groups, scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, Zealots, a lot of these people were diametrically opposed to each other, either religiously or politically. They all saw Jesus as a common enemy, and they would actually join forces to get rid of Jesus. Paul used this to his advantage in Acts chapter 23. He was arrested. He was placed on trial. He was brought before the Sanhedrin. And when he was before the Sanhedrin, he was being brought on trial for preaching the gospel and so forth. And so he could see he was not going to get a fair trial. And so this scripture is so good. I love this scripture in Acts 23, 6 to 9. It says, "But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other part were Pharisees, he cried out in the council, 'Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee and the son of a Pharisee,'" which he was. "According to the hope of the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged." Well, in a sense he was, because he was preaching the resurrection of Jesus. "And when he had said this, the dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection and no angel or spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. Then there arose a loud outcry, and the scribes of the Pharisee party arose and protested, saying, 'We find no evil in this man, but if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God.'" So it was like he used that against them. They got into such a brawl they couldn't bring the place back into order again, because Paul had a word of wisdom. "I'm a Pharisee, the son of a resurrection." Got them going at each other's throats again instead of going after him. All right, quickly now. Got to get through this. The Herodians. The Herodians, they were an exclusively political party who took their name from Herod, derived their authority from the Roman government. They were a pro-Roman. They liked the way things were. They liked the Roman rule. They liked the Roman government. They were Jewish people, but they were working with the Romans, and they didn't like Jesus because they viewed him as a revolutionary. This idea about king, his kingdom, all these kind of talk, they didn't like it. They felt like it was going to be anti-Rome in many ways, and so they saw Christ as a revolutionary, and they wanted him out. Well, you can understand that the Herodians were not real popular among most Jews, because most Jews hated the Romans, but these were a political party that did like the Romans. And it's interesting, again, how they when you understand who these people are, you understand some of the reaction that they get. So it says in, for instance, Mark chapter 12, verse 13, "Then they sent to him some of the Pharisees and Herodians," who, again, were not normal guys that would hang out together, "to catch him in his words. When they had come, they said to him, 'Teacher, we know that you are true.'" They don't really, that's the Pharisee talking. "And care about no one, for you do not regard the person of men, but teach the way of God in truth." They're setting him up. Anytime somebody starts buttering you up before they ask your question, you know they're setting you up. "Pastor Bill, we know you're a wonderful man. You really hear from God. We know, no. Now tell me." Okay. So that's what they're doing to Jesus. "We know that you are," well, they don't practice like they know that. "You are true, care about no one." You care about no one in the sense that it doesn't matter who asks you a question, you'll give them the true answer anyway, even if it's us Herodians. And even there's a Herodian standing there. Anything said against Rome, bam, they'll jump right all over that. "We know that you're a man of truth. We know." So what's the question? Tell us then. Tell us the truth. "Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" One of those questions, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, There's no right answer to that in most people's eyes. Man, if I say, "No, you don't need to pay taxes to Caesar," the Jews will be happy. But the Herodians, who are pro-Roman, they'll go tell on you and you'll get in trouble. That's revolutionary talk. Throw off tax revolts. Who's ever heard of that? Well, that's how America got started. But then the other ones are there. The Jews are there. No, you need to pay taxes. "Oh, we don't want to pay taxes. We hate Rome." So it's one of those. They're trying to catch him. It says right at the beginning they're trying to catch him in his words. So of course he has a word of wisdom, word of knowledge. He's just too good for him. But he, knowing their hypocrisy, said to them, "Why do you test me? Bring me a denarii that I may see it." So they brought it to him and said, "Whose image is on, an inscription is on this?" "Caesar's." And then he said, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God." What was he implying? Whose inscription is on you? Whose image is on you? You're made in God's image. Okay, that's Caesar, that's his system, that's his image. He provides the tax, he built the roads. Okay, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar. But wait a minute. Give to God the things that are God. That's you. So, great answer. But when you see who's standing there asking it, it kind of gives a little bit more meaning to it. Finally, we have the Zealots. The Zealots were a Jewish nationalistic party. Those are the ones that were on the opposite side of the spectrum of the Herodians. They wanted to be rid of the Roman rule over the Jews and were not opposed to using violent means to overthrow the Roman yoke. And so they were constantly kind of plotting. They were like the underground terrorists who were trying to make it difficult for Rome. and always trying to overthrow them whatever way they could. And then the last one here is Galileans. This is a party that arose in northern Palestine. Even though Galilee was a region, it also became known as a little group or party. Consisted of the followers of Judas of Galilee. He was also violently opposed to Roman rule. The Galileans were quite radical in their expression of their views. They incited riots, and at one point in time, Pilate brought them under and killed many of them. In Luke, it's reported in Luke chapter 13, verse 1 to 3. And what Jesus' opponents were constantly trying to do was to link Jesus with this party. If you could link Jesus with this party, then Pilate would certainly want to condemn him. And so when people are accusing him of being Galileans, it isn't always just the vernacular of the village that they lived in. Sometimes it's a political party that they want to identify them with. You know, if you could, this is what they tried to do with Martin Luther. This is why they tried to get Martin Luther killed. John Huss had existed before him and taught many of the same things that Martin Luther did. And he was burned at the stake by the state. And so when Martin Luther was on trial, they tried to say, well, this is the same stuff that Huss teaches. Well, if you can identify him with Huss, who was burned at the stake, maybe you can get rid of Luther the same way. And that's exactly what they were trying to do with Jesus. All right, Pilate, you've already crushed this Galilean stuff. Here this guy's connected with them too. And so they were using that against Jesus. What's the general timeline for the events covered in the New Testament? Quickly go through that in order to better understand the way in which the events of the New Testament relate to each other. The following timeline will offer insight. We try to give you a little bit of a running date there. Whenever we're dealing with dates, of course, we're dealing with a certain amount of conjecture. And so you may find a book or two that might have a little bit different date. But at least this gives you a general flow of probably where things are. And this is important for us, especially as we look at the books of the Bible, because sometimes, we get an idea that, well, because of the way they occur in our Bible, that's probably the way they were written. And that's not so. I mean, when we think of what was written, we might think, well, maybe Matthew's Gospel was written first, or Mark's Gospel was written second. But when we realize that, like Mark's Gospel was probably not written until 56 and A.D., and that some of these books were written at different times, then it kind of helps us to see kind of how things flow. The book of Matthew was probably written much later. Mark's probably the first Gospel to be written. John's Gospel might have been written more towards the end of his life, actually. It's hard to know exactly on all those, but most of his books seem to have been written when he was on the Isle of Patmos. So, anyway, this will give us just a general thing to hang things on.